There are moments in a human life when thinking becomes unavoidable, when the familiar stories we tell ourselves begin to loosen, when we sense that something beneath the surface is quietly shifting. These moments do not always arrive with drama. Often they appear in the quiet, when the world around us is still, when the noise of daily life softens just enough for thought to emerge. Hannah Arendt understood this space with unusual clarity. She believed that thinking is not simply an act of the mind. It is a way of living, a way of meeting reality, a form of internal companionship that keeps us honest. Arendt wrote, "The life of the mind is the soundless dialogue we have with ourselves, and as a species, this may sound simple, yet it reveals something profound." Most of us live at a distance from our own inner dialogue. We move through our days responding to obligations, expectations, habits, fears. We react more than we reflect. We repeat more than we inquire. But Arendt suggests that the quiet dialogue inside us shapes our moral life, our choices, our responsibility, our sense of who we are. When we think, we are not just processing information. We are shaping the person who acts in the world. Her work invites us to consider something subtle. The capacity to think for ourselves is not automatic. It requires cultivation. It requires solitude. It requires an inner willingness to confront uncomfortable truths rather than seeking easy answers. Arendt believed that thinking is not about finding certainty. It is about remaining open to the complexity of experience, staying awake to the world, resisting the temptation to settle for borrowed convictions. To think, in her view, is to remain in dialogue with oneself. And this dialogue is often challenging. Because when we truly think, we inevitably encounter aspects of ourselves we would prefer to avoid. Our contradictions, our blind spots, our unexamined assumptions, our internalized fears. Thinking brings us into contact with ourselves, and this contact can be unsettling. But Arendt did not see this discomfort as failure. She saw it as the beginning of freedom. She believed that freedom is not merely the ability to act, it is the ability to act with awareness. When we think, we create the inner space necessary for freedom. We create the ability to choose our actions intentionally rather than reflexively. We step out of automatic living and into conscious living. Arendt's emphasis on thinking was not abstract. It was rooted in her experience of witnessing a society drift into thoughtlessness, into a state where people stopped questioning the moral meaning of their actions and simply followed the patterns around them. She saw how dangerous it can be when individuals lose contact with their inner dialogue. When people stop thinking, they become vulnerable to the ideas of others, vulnerable to fear, vulnerable to authority, vulnerable to the inertia of habits. Yet Arendt never reduced this phenomenon to something simplistic. She did not believe that people become thoughtless because they are inherently cruel or indifferent. She believed that thoughtlessness arises from the desire to escape complexity. It is easier to follow than to question, easier to repeat than to reflect, easier to comply than to confront. Thoughtlessness offers the comfort of certainty, the comfort of belonging, the comfort of not having to stand alone. But Arendt urges us to see the quiet danger in this comfort. Without thinking, our actions can drift into consequences we never intended. Without thinking, we betray ourselves without noticing. Without thinking, we lose the inner compass that anchors our humanity. This is why Arendt saw solitude as essential. Solitude is not loneliness. Solitude is the inner space where thought becomes possible. It is the space where we step back from the collective noise and listen inward, where we face ourselves honestly, where we nurture the moral faculty that guides our choices. In solitude, we are no longer performing for others. We are no longer shaped by external pressures. We meet ourselves without the protective shield of distraction. And in this encounter, Arendt suggests, we learn to think truthfully. But truth for Arendt was not a static object. It was an active relationship. She wrote, "Truth is what we cannot change." Yet she also understood that we rarely live in direct contact with truth. Our minds construct narratives, interpretations, justifications. Thinking is the process that brings us back to what is real, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. Thinking requires courage. It requires us to question the stories we inherited, the roles we play, the beliefs we hold, the fears we protect. It requires us to ask whether our actions reflect our convictions or merely our conditioning. It requires us to notice when we are avoiding ourselves. Arendt believed that the ability to think protects us from the erosion of our integrity. When we think, we engage in what she called the silent dialogue of the two-in-one, the part of us that experiences the world and the part of us that questions that experience. These two parts of the self remain in relationship, and this relationship is the foundation of moral life. Without that relationship, Arendt warns, a person can do almost anything, not because they desire harm, but because they no longer feel the internal friction that thinking creates. Thought introduces hesitation, consideration, reflection. It slows us down just enough to ask, is this right? Is this true? Does this align with who I wish to be? In a world that urges speed, urgency, quick conclusions, immediate reactions, Arendt's emphasis on slowing down to think feels radical. It is a form of resistance. It is the refusal to be swept away by the momentum of culture. It is the commitment to remain in dialogue with oneself even when the world demands performance. Arendt's perspective also helps us understand the moment in life when we begin to outgrow our former ways of thinking. As we mature, we begin to see the difference between beliefs we actually hold and beliefs we merely inherited. This realization can be unsettling. It creates a tension between the self we have been and the self we are becoming. Thinking becomes both the cause and the consequence of this transition. When we begin to think more deeply, we inevitably outgrow stale narratives. We outgrow simplified versions of ourselves. We outgrow patterns that once felt natural. The inner dialogue becomes more nuanced, more honest, more demanding. This shift often brings grief. Because when we outgrow old ways of thinking, we also outgrow versions of ourselves and the relationships, habits, and dreams built upon those versions. Arendt understood that thinking does not isolate us from grief. It leads us into it. But she believed that grief, when approached with awareness, clarifies the self. It helps us understand what truly matters, what remains when illusions fall away. Arendt saw thinking as a way of taking responsibility for our inner life. Responsibility, in her view, was not about accepting blame. It was about acknowledging our capacity to shape our world, both internally and externally. When we think, we take responsibility for the quality of our actions, the integrity of our choices, and the truthfulness of our inner dialogue. She insisted that responsibility begins in the private realm. Before we act in the world, we must ask ourselves who we want to be. Before we speak, we must consider the meaning of our words. Before we choose, we must reflect on what our choices reveal about us. This inward process shapes our outward presence. Arendt often wrote about the distinction between thinking and knowing. Knowing is about information. Thinking is about meaning. Knowing can accumulate facts. Thinking asks what those facts require of us. Knowing is finite. Thinking is ongoing. Knowing can be done quickly. Thinking takes time. In this sense, thinking is a form of humility. It acknowledges that the world cannot be reduced to simple answers. It acknowledges that our perspective is limited. It acknowledges that our understanding is always unfolding. Arendt also believes that thinking protects us from isolation, not by connecting us to others directly, but by connecting us to ourselves. When we are in conversation with our inner life, we never fully feel abandoned. We have an internal companion. We have a place to return to. We have a source of meaning that cannot be taken from us. This inner companionship becomes especially important during transitions, particularly the transitions that leave us feeling confused or disoriented. Arendt understood that change often disrupts our sense of identity. It challenges our previous assumptions. It forces us to reconsider what we believe and why. Thinking becomes a stabilizing force during these times. It helps us navigate uncertainty without collapsing into fear. It allows us to explore our shifting identity without losing ourselves. It invites us to remain present even when the future feels opaque. Arendt wrote, "For the person who thinks life is not something that must be endured, it is something that must be understood. Understanding does not eliminate difficulty, but it gives difficulty meaning. It transforms suffering into insight, confusion into inquiry, isolation into solitude. This transformation is not immediate. Thinking is slow work. It unfolds over time. It requires sitting with questions that do not have answers. It requires tolerating ambiguity. It requires returning to the same thought repeatedly until it reveals something new. In this slow unfolding, a person begins to develop what Arendt called soundless integrity, a sense of self that is grounded, thoughtful, internally accountable. This integrity is not visible from the outside. It does not seek recognition. It does not rely on approval. It emerges quietly from the ongoing dialogue between the parts of oneself. Arendt believed that individuals with this kind of integrity become anchors in their communities. They do not conform blindly. They do not follow impulsively. They bring depth to their interactions, patience to their judgments, honesty to their words. Their presence becomes a stabilizing force in a world that often feels chaotic. But Arendt also understood that the path of thinking can be isolating. Society often values productivity over reflection, certainty over doubt, alignment over independence. When a person begins to think deeply, they may feel out of step with the people around them. They may feel misunderstood. They may feel as though they are living at a different tempo. This feeling is painful, yet it is part of the process. Arendt encourages us to embrace this isolation, not as rejection, but as a sign that our inner life is awakening. When we think, we naturally diverge from collective patterns. We begin to see nuances others overlook. We become more sensitive to contradictions. We notice when words and actions do not align. This sensitivity brings clarity, but it also brings responsibility, because once we see, we cannot pretend not to. Once we understand, we cannot return to unthinking conformity. Thinking changes us. It alters the way we move through the world. And this alteration can feel lonely. Yet Arendt believed that loneliness can transform into solitude when we develop an inner relationship with ourselves. In solitude, we are not alone. We are accompanied by thought, reflection, understanding. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, a place to return to when the world feels overwhelming. This sanctuary is essential for sustaining integrity in a world that pressures individuals to abandon their inner truth. Thinking allows us to resist this pressure. It allows us to remain connected to our core. It allows us to act in alignment with who we want to be rather than who we are expected to be. Arendt's emphasis on action also deepens our understanding of thinking. She believed that thinking prepares the ground for action, but it does not replace it. Thought without action becomes fragile. Action without thought becomes dangerous. The balance between the two creates a life that is both reflective and engaged. Action, in Arendt's view, is the way we reveal ourselves to the world. It is the way we make our inner dialogue visible. It is the way we participate in the shared life of humanity. But action must emerge from thought. Otherwise, it becomes impulsive, reactive, unanchored. To act with awareness is to act with courage. It is to bring the truth of our inner life into the public realm. This truth may not always be accepted. It may challenge others, it may disrupt familiar patterns, but Arendt believed that acting truthfully is essential for a meaningful life. She wrote, "The smallest act in the most limited circumstances bears the seed of boundlessness." This means that even our smallest choices matter. They shape our inner world, they shape our relationships, they shape our future, they shape the world we inhabit. Thinking helps us recognize the weight of these choices. It reminds us that we are not passive observers of our lives. We are active participants. We have the capacity to choose. We have the responsibility to choose. But responsibility does not mean burden. Responsibility, in Arendt's philosophy, is a form of dignity. It is the acknowledgement that our life has meaning, that our choices matter, that our actions reflect who we are becoming. Arendt believed that each human life contains a spark of uniqueness, something that cannot be replicated or replaced. Thinking helps us discover that spark. It helps us understand our particular way of being in the world. It helps us recognize the value of our perspective. This recognition is not about ego. It is about authenticity. It is about honoring the truth that arises when we listen inward. It is about treating our inner life with respect. The more we engage in thinking, the more we understand that our identity is not fixed. It evolves with our reflections. It changes as we confront new experiences. It deepens as we learn to hold complexity. This evolving identity requires patience. We cannot force ourselves into clarity. We cannot demand immediate understanding. We must allow our thoughts to unfold at their own pace. Arendt believed that thinking is a lifelong process. There is no final conclusion. There is only the ongoing dialogue. The more we think, the more we understand that we do not know. The more we understand that we do not know, the more open we become to learning. This openness is the foundation of wisdom. Wisdom is not about possessing answers. It is about sustaining curiosity. It is about remaining humble in the face of vastness. It is about acknowledging the limits of our perspective while still engaging with the world wholeheartedly. Arendt's invitation is subtle but profound. Live in relationship with your own mind. Do not abandon your inner dialogue. Do not silence the questions that arise within you. Do not trade your integrity for comfort. Do not seek certainty at the cost of truth. The world may tempt you toward thoughtlessness. Routine may numb you. Fear may narrow your vision. But thinking keeps you awake. It keeps you honest. It keeps you connected to the dignity of your humanity. Arendt believed that thinking is the most human thing we do. It is what allows us to navigate complexity without collapsing into simplicity. It is what allows us to remain free even in unfree circumstances. It is what allows us to understand ourselves deeply enough to act with courage. In the quiet moments when you feel uncertain, when you feel the weight of transition, when the stories you once believed begin to unravel, return to the dialogue within. Allow your thoughts to unfold. Allow your questions to deepen. Allow your inner life to guide you. You do not need to force clarity. You do not need to know the destination. You only need to remain in conversation with yourself, because in that conversation you will find truth not as certainty but as presence. You will find freedom not as independence from the world, but as alignment with your inner life. You will find integrity not as perfection, but as the willingness to think honestly. And slowly, quietly, you will become someone capable of meeting the world with depth, with courage, with clarity. Arendt reminds us that we are never truly alone when we think. The dialogue continues, the mind unfolds, the self listens, and through this listening we become more fully ourselves.